Um, so I guess topics to cover today are going to be blockchain, cryptocurrency, and the meaning of money. So nothing major. So I guess the first thing that I want to sort of point out is that blockchain, cryptocurrency, and Bitcoin are very different things. Obviously, they're related, but I think it's actually important that we break it down and look at each one individually. And I liken this to the same way that like a DVD is not the same as a film, is not the same as a Harry Potter. And so at the base layer, we have a technology, which is really just an idea. So for a DVD, it's a specification for how we put marks on a metal plate so we can store data. And blockchain in some ways is similar. It's just a set of rules for organizing data and how we then update that data. And then the next layer, we have a use case. So a lot of technologies have got multiple use cases. So, you know, a DVD could also be used for like backing up things as well as films. And then on top of that, we then have like a particular instantiation. So you've got like Harry Potter and Bitcoin. And I'd say at their core, like Harry Potter is a story. And I'd say at its core, Bitcoin is an economic policy. And actually, you can, to some extent, swap these different layers out. So governments could tomorrow decide that they want to follow the economic policy of Bitcoin and like run that on the traditional banking system. Or we could say, actually, we really don't like Bitcoin, but we love the idea of blockchain and cryptocurrency. So we're going to run like a sort of crypto-based dollar or a crypto-based pound on top of a blockchain and cryptocurrency infrastructure. So that's why I think it's sort of important to split these out, because you might come away deciding you really love one part of this, but hate some other part. Or maybe you love all of it, or whatever it might be. But like, I think we should split it out and like look at each of these components individually. So I guess let's start at the base layer, which is blockchain. So to some extent, we don't really need to know how a blockchain works on a technical level. But I'll just quickly run through a few points because it will refer back to it later. So the general idea is that we split our data down into sort of discrete chunks, and then we attach some metadata, like a timestamp to these chunks. And then we string all these chunks together into a chain. And each chunk refers to the previous one using a digital signature called a hash, which is just a sort of summary of the data in some ways, but changing any part of the data will completely change the output hash. And so we immediately run into a problem because our chain of blocks can split where there's multiple blocks that are referring to the same previous block. And so we have this issue of consensus, which is really working out, okay, if there are multiple competing chains, which one represents the state of truth of the world? And so we have this rule that the longest chain always wins, which isn't enough in itself, because if it's easy to make blocks, you can just end up with anyone could generate, you know, 1 million new blocks and get the longest chain. So we also have some sort of proof mechanism, and that proof mechanism is really just designed to limit who can add blocks to the chain and when they can do so. So the famous one used by Bitcoin, proof of work. So I said that each block refers to the previous using a sort of this hash, which is just a digital signature. We can add additional constraints to this. So a really simple example is the hash has got to be a multiple of 10. And in that case, you have to guess roughly 10 hashes before you find a valid block. For Bitcoin, it's more like 1 in a trillion or more is a valid hash. And so this is why we have to have like many computers guessing many numbers and blocks before we find the next valid block. And this is what's using all the energy. So when people say, oh, Bitcoin's, you know, destroying the planet, they're referring to the blockchain. And actually the next layers of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin itself could be implemented in other ways. And so there are alternatives like proof of stake. Rather than having a huge amount of compute power, you instead lock up a certain amount of money in the network. And if you misbehave, the rest of the network can effectively vote to cut your money. So if you've, you know, put £1 million into the network and then you lie and come up with an invalid block, the rest of the network can delete that effectively. So you're punished for misbehaving. Proof of authority, you could effectively have like a government say, hey, look, the top 50 banks in the country all have the right to add blocks onto the end of this chain. And that's like it uses way less energy because, you know, rather than having thousands of nodes adding blocks and guessing numbers, you've just got, you know, 50 banks. The problem, of course, is that you put trust in government and banks. So whether or not you want to do that, it depends a lot on your sort of philosophy. And the final really interesting one is proof of humanity, which is the idea of saying, okay, we're going to make these these computers that are running the chain like really simple, so everyone can have it on their phone. But then we have some mechanism by proving that actually this phone is actually owned by a real human. And so every human has an equal chance of being the next block producer. And the benefit of that, of course, is that if you manage to issue the next block, you get rewarded with new tokens. So effectively, you get an income. And so that's why you'd be willing to lock up money or lots of compute power in these other proof mechanisms. So what's the point of all this? Well, the idea is that we get an immutable but appendable data structure. So we can keep on adding new blocks to the end of the chain, but it's really, really difficult to go back and edit the history because we only accept the longest chain as being valid. And there's this proof mechanism, which makes it really difficult to add new blocks onto the end of the chain. It's really hard for someone to go back 100 blocks and catch up with the current state of the chain. So as long as no entity gets more than 50% of the control, so with proof of work, 50% of compute power, proof of stake, 50% of the money, proof of humanity, 50% of humans need to agree before this goes through, then they can't catch up with the rest of the world who's running under the old set of the rules. And so this is obviously important in a financial system where we don't want people to go back and say, oh, actually, I did or didn't pay you in the past. And it's also, we tend to make this data completely public, which makes it, anyone can run the code and verify that all the rules have been obeyed. So let's actually get on to the use cases. There are other use cases of blockchain, which we can perhaps discuss later. But for the sake of brevity, we'll focus on sort of the economic side of things. So cryptocurrency is, of course, the main use case. And the idea is really simple. We just store a ledger of transactions. So, Bob paid Alice £10, and then in some later block, Alice then paid Jim £5, and so on and so on. And we also sign these blocks with public-private keys. And this technology is already in use. So every time you visit a website and see this padlock, you're using public-private keys. So the server has basically broadcasted a public key to the world and then signs some data with their private key. And that proves to you that you're definitely talking to the person that you think you're talking to. And so in the same way, we use this to make sure, okay, if Bob said he wants to send some money, it really is Bob who's actually sending the money. And so this is where I guess we run into another problem that people often say is that crypto is anonymous and shady. And really that's because your on-chain identity is just a public key, which is just this completely random string of text. Whereas in the real world, obviously we have people. And it's really hard to know who owns which public key because it could be sort of any combination, or people could have multiple wallets each. So public keys can also be called wallets. It's the same thing. This is like a big criticism of crypto, but actually the blockchain itself, all the data is completely public. And so once you know who owns a particular address, it's actually really simple to trace the flow of money over time. And more crypto exchanges and such like are adding know your customer regulations. So if you want to convert your pounds or dollars into crypto, you have to say who you are. And so you can actually end up with a system which is way more transparent than the current way of multiple competing standards and banks across the world, because you've got this public data set that absolutely anyone can query. And so if law enforcement can say, okay, this particular address is owned by this particular person, it's then super easy for them to track through where the money has flown and where it's come from. And they don't have to fight different legal systems around the world because you've got this one open data set. So I actually think crypto is way more transparent than the current system. And there are issues around anonymity and how much transparency do we want, and do we want a system where people are forced to have this know your customer regulation before they can use crypto? And these are all sort of open questions, but it's kind of a sliding scale of transparency versus privacy. The next, I guess, use case, which is really major, is smart contracts. So the idea is, as well as storing this list of transactions on chain, we can also store code itself on chain. Now, this is really interesting because suddenly no one can change this code once it exists. And all of our transactions can now interact with this code. And so you can implement pretty much anything you can imagine. So you could have like an insurance system. So rather than having a company where you pay your premium. You have a smart contract that 1,000 users all pool their money together into this contract, and then you have some voting mechanism to say, okay, is a particular claim valid, before you then give money back out. But I think the most sort of fundamental part of this is it's globally available because it's running on this open chain, and there's no sort of permission of who can use it. Someone in the West could develop this insurance system, but then someone in an underbanked area in Africa where they haven't got access to the sort of financial infrastructure we have, can, as long as they've got an internet connection, can then connect and use this. And the other thing is that rather than having a company with a huge amount of overheads, you just have this piece of code, and the users effectively own the code, and own the liquidity, because a lot of these systems work by, okay, lots of users come together and deposit money, and they own some share of the profits which are then generated from that. And so I think it's a much fairer system in terms of distributing profits to everyone, and including everyone who can then play on like both sides of the field. They can provide money, or they can claim money from the insurance system. And there's also like liquidity pools for trading between tokens, and like yield aggregators, which are, I guess, kind of savings accounts, where we're going to automatically move your money between these other different sort of base layers in order to try and generate interest and diversify your risk. So any sort of financial system that you can sort of imagine currently working on the traditional banking infrastructure, the idea is that one day we'll have this running on top of blockchain as well, but in a much more open way, which is much more available to more of the world. And I guess I can't really do a crypto presentation without talking about NFTs, or non-fungible tokens. The idea of these is actually remarkably simple. So most currencies are fungible, which means we can divide them up. So a £5 note is equivalent to £5 coins, and we don't actually care which specific £5 note we have. But this isn't true for a lot of assets. So like the Mona Lisa, we don't want to rip up into smaller parts and then like piece back together later. And the same is like, a ticket. There's only a single ticket for a particular seat in a seat. And, your house is unique. And so there's a lot of stuff about people spending like, millions of pounds on like pictures on, JPEGs of monkeys on the internet, and people going, oh, isn't this ridiculous? Actually, I think NFTs are going to be a really important building block if we do transition to a world in which everything is running on chain, because it allows us to then, have like, say a smart contract which acts as like a mortgage broker, and contains ownership of your house, and as you start to pay it off, more of that contract becomes owned by you rather than the original sort of like lender. And so I think this is going to be a really important part if we do transition to a system which uses blockchain as the sort of base of the financial system. And actually, I think it would be wrong to say that the current use of NFTs for artwork is completely ridiculous as well. Like, I think it's just another medium, and I think it will stick around because there are some really fun and cool things you can do in the digital world, which you can't do in the physical world. But it is probably overhyped at the moment. And I think there is going to be a reckoning for a lot of people that have, put huge amounts of money into these projects, when inevitably there's going to be a phase where it comes crashing back down, a bit like the dot-com bubble, and some things are going to survive and a lot of things aren't. But it's about building the base technology there, and sort of experimenting with different ideas. And I don't think that's a dreadful thing. Okay, so we then get onto the sort of the elephant in the room, Bitcoin itself. So I said earlier that I think Bitcoin at its core is really an economic policy. And so this is sort of a comparison of Bitcoin versus gold versus the US dollar. So there are a couple of factors. So circulating supply and maximum supply. So circulating supply is really how much of this is currently floating around in the economy. So for gold, there's currently like 200,000 tons of gold that we've dug out of the ground. And we estimate there are only 250 tons in total on planet Earth. Now, technically, you could get more, from asteroids or whatever, but let's ignore that for now. And so, the total supply of gold is capped. Whereas if you look at something like the US dollar, there are currently like $21 trillion floating around the economy, but they can just be created at the whim of the government. So Bitcoin, in this sense, is obviously much closer to gold because we've got a fixed supply which is enforced by codes, and as long as we have this 50% rule that I said earlier, that as long as no one entity gets 51% of the compute power, they can't change the rules. So we know that this is like a capped supply. We also have a concept of like an emission schedule. So how quickly a new Bitcoin being created, how quickly is new gold being dug out of the ground. And so for the US dollar, if we look historically over the last 50 years or so, we see that roughly 7% of the current circulating supply is created as new dollars each year. But obviously this varies a lot. So during COVID, we saw something like 30% of all dollars in existence were created within like a year after COVID starting. With gold, it sort of depends on market forces. If the price of gold goes up, then you get more miners coming into the space. Bitcoin's interesting in this regard because actually it's a codified and a schedule. There's like a known schedule of when each Bitcoin is going to be released. And even if you start throwing more compute power at it, the problem of finding the next valid hash gets harder and harder the more compute power you throw at it. So therefore, like we know that the last Bitcoin is going to be mined in, I think it's 2140, so yeah, 120 years from now. So the new money, obviously for gold, is paid to the miners to get out of the ground. For Bitcoin, it's paid to the people running the computers that find the next valid block. And for the government, or sorry, for the US dollar, it's obviously at the whim of the government. They can spend it on, they can give it to sort of companies or whatever that have lobbied them, which obviously we don't think is a good idea. Or maybe they're spending it on sort of welfare programs and helping people during COVID, which maybe is a good idea. And so maybe governments are good at allocating resources and maybe they're not, and each person has their own sort of view on that. But I think the most important thing we get down to is the inflation rate. So with governments, like the Federal Reserve aims for 2% a year. During COVID, we saw about 30% of money was created during a year. And so does that mean the inflation rate is like 30%? Well, we'll get on to that. For gold, we're digging out about 3,000 tons of gold out of the ground a year, which is 1.5%. And for Bitcoin, we've got this scheduled decrease. So it's 1.7% at the moment, but going down. And I put 2% including loss because actually each year we're like forgetting passwords to like Bitcoin wallets. And so we have Bitcoin, which is completely non-recoverable. And so actually there is an argument to be made that the supply of Bitcoin is decreasing over time rather than increasing. And so, yeah, you might have sort of got the sense that my core idea around this is inflation actually a good thing? So the Federal Reserve targets 2%. And the reason they often give for this is that it encourages spending and investment, because if you know your money is going to be worth less in 10 years' time, you're more likely to spend it today. And this produces more growth in the economy. So people say, oh, this is a great idea. It also reduces intergenerational wealth because I can't pass down millions and billions of pounds to my children because it's going to be worth less over time. So this sort of avoids these sort of family dynasties forming and going on forever. And the other example that people often give for inflation being a good thing is that it helps debtors at the expense of savers. Because if you borrow £100, in 10 years' time, that £100 is going to be worth less, so it's easier to pay back. And so people say, well, isn't this good? We're helping the poorest in society. But it's complete disaster, because what's actually happening is the poorest in society are charged huge interest rates, by credit card companies, 30%, by payday lenders, 100%. So they're being charged way more interest than the actual inflation rate. So the people who are really benefiting from this are people that can borrow money at low interest rates, which is governments, because they're able to issue bonds at 1% or less interest. So governments can spend recklessly, and banks can or like financial institutions can get access to really cheap money and then invest it in risky assets, and then it ends up being the taxpayer that then has to come in and bail them out, like we saw in 2008. And that's not actually a dig at the government. I think that's a good thing, because we end up with huge amounts of people's pensions and savings tied up in these institutions. And so if governments just let it all collapse, that's going to cause a lot of pain as well. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that the government's bailing it out, but actually we should perhaps tackle the root cause of this and say, well, let's not try and encourage people to take on debt at the expense of savers. And actually, if we look through history, we see inflation always ends badly. And so we have, various steps. The first step we often see is that asset prices soar. This obviously makes the rich happy because the rich own assets. It makes homeowners happy because house prices go soaring up. But the people who don't own these assets are left behind. And the cost of living actually increases more slowly. And this is because it's a sort of psychological thing where if companies suddenly doubled the price of food overnight, even if government has printed twice as much money overnight, people won't be able to afford that and won't accept that immediately because the money hasn't filtered down into the hands of everyone in society. But behind the scenes, you get this pressure building and building and building of all this money that's been created and is circulating around the economy. And then suddenly some catalyst comes along and you see this uncontrollable increase in prices of assets. So, maybe Russia goes to war in Ukraine and oil jumps up by 50% in a month. And you think, well, okay, sure, obviously, like Russia going to war with Ukraine is a problem and does affect this. But actually, I think there are other pressures that have been building behind the scenes. And so together with like the poor being left behind because they can't afford assets, and also the cost of living increases rising, you end up getting discontent in the population, which leads to populism. Politicians come in and say, we know who's to blame. It's this person that's at fault. And this blame inevitably leads to revolution and war. And the victors of this war usher in a new world order. And it might sound like I'm describing the events of today, but these points are actually taken from this book called The Changing World Order by Ray Dalio, which actually looks back at the last 400 years of transitions between, like the British Empire transitioning to a dollar-based economy. And before that, I think it was the Denmark sort of East India Company transitioning to the British Empire. And these points we actually see throughout history over and over. The same happened in Germany. They printed huge amounts of money because they couldn't pay off debts for World War One. And discontent in the population then led to Hitler being voted into power, which then led to World War II. And this isn't just a Western problem, and it isn't just a modern problem. The Roman Empire collapsed because the silver content of their coins went from 100% at the start of the empire to 3% by the end of the empire. The currency was devalued, trade fell apart, and the empire splintered. And it's not a Western problem because this has happened in early China, the 10th century onwards. China introduced paper currencies, and time again, these paper currencies were devalued and replaced by something else. We also have another problem today, is that technology is making this way worse because technology is inherently deflationary. In 1971, we'd have to spend 95,000, which today is 5 million, on a computer that has 5,000 transistors. Today we can get 3 million times the compute power for a 500th of the price. So technology is completely transforming. It's giving us more and more for cheaper and cheaper, which is deflation rather than inflation. And people think this is just related to hardware, but actually technology is making everything cheaper. So 200 years ago, if you wanted to listen to music, you'd have to go to a concert hall and pay to see a live musician, which is inconvenient and expensive. Today we can stream practically unlimited music for free anywhere in the world. 500 years ago, maps were hand-drawn, exquisite objects. Today, everyone has access to free maps, which talk to you and give you directions for free. Over time, we're getting more and more for less. So if governments are actually targeting 2% inflation, inevitably, they have to keep printing at a faster and faster rate. Governments, so the idea of money printing is that you ease the economy, you give access to more capital during recession, during difficult times. And in the hard times, you then start to pay that debt back because you can afford to. What we actually see is that during the 2008 recession, we get this huge spike and governments never repaid it. So then the COVID recession comes along and we get this even bigger spike. And the book I referred to earlier, The Changing World Order, refers to this, that every 10 years or so, we get the business cycle recession. And every 100 years or so, the government debt burdens get so large that it just becomes unsustainable. And so there's a book here, The Price of Tomorrow, which suggests a simple solution. What if we just accept deflation instead? Because the issue is with this, in order to get deflation, we have to have a currency which governments can't print, because the only way governments can deal with the debt burden is cutting spending, raising taxes, restructuring or writing off debts. All of these make someone unhappy, or printing money, which seems like an easy fix. But as we've seen earlier, the inflation that this inevitably leads to ends up causing discontent and problems downstream. Gold, on the other hand, is the classic hard money. And so we can see on this chart that for the last 400 years or so, it's maintained roughly constant pricing power. In fact, we can look at, a Roman centurion was paid 38 ounces of gold, which roughly translates to $73,000 today. An equivalent US captain today gets paid roughly the same amount of money. We can look at, bread in 500 BC, an ounce of gold would buy you 350 kilograms of bread. Today, roughly the same, 391 kilograms of bread. So this is the difference that hard money makes, because governments can't just infinitely create it out of thin air. And so what would it actually look like if we adopted a standard like this? Well, I think the first thing is that deflation would be this common inheritance for all of mankind. There's this idea that a rising tide will lift all boats, that innovation makes everyone's life better off. Now, of course, that's true to some extent, but it only works if we're all benefiting. And the problem is that the people who benefit are the people who know how to play the system, that know how to invest in the stock market and such. If your currency itself is deflating, then all you have to do is hold on to the currency. And that's so much simpler to teach people. Just hold the currency, and over time, you will be better off, because that currency is going to purchase more and more over time, rather than purchasing less and less. The next thing is it encourages responsibility. We've already said that inflation, rewards people taking on debt. But that introduces massive risk into the system, and deflation discourages taking on debt. So we should see less debt be taken on. Governments will be forced to deal with problems because they can't just print money, like they can't create it out of thin air. And governments will always do that because it's easier to print money today and make it, the next person in office, it's their problem to deal with the consequences. Whereas instead, governments will actually have to tackle with the problems rather than letting them build up over many, many years. And we'll also see that if assets do grow in price, that must be due to real growth and real wealth creation. And so all this malinvestment of people just piling money into crazy ideas in the stock market, and the stock market just soaring, and everyone thinking they're a genius, when actually it's just caused by all this new money coming into the system. And the final thing is deflation might actually solve, or at least massively help towards the climate crisis. We have this issue of everyone wanting to just buy stuff constantly. If you know for a fact that just holding onto your money is going to make it worth way more in the future, are you really going to, buy that coffee today when in 50 years time, that same amount of money might buy you a house? Obviously this works to some extent because people can invest in pensions or stock markets. And so we already have this, but I think it's way simpler for people to understand when it's just holding on to money than trying to take on massive risks and, being worried that they could lose out by making these investments. And obviously we do want growth, but I think actually as a society, we should be transitioning to a world where we're thinking about the future more than the present, because we've already got such technological innovation, and it's just increasing that actually we don't need this growth at all costs mindset. So hard money, gold has always been the traditional answer. But the problem with gold is that it's really slow to move. It's hard to verify, is this pure gold? Especially if it's in large quantities, because you need to take lots of samples, and it's really hard to store in a secure environment. And so inevitably, rather than actually holding gold, people hold pieces of paper which are promises for gold. And the issue with this is my asset then becomes someone else's liability. The bank owes me something rather than me actually having an asset. It's also easy to confiscate because all the gold is in one place, and you get hidden risks because the bank can issue more paper than is actual gold. And so inevitably a gold standard falls apart, and that's what we saw in like 1971, where the world moved off the gold standard to pure fiat currencies. So this is where something like Bitcoin would come in. It's scarce like gold, but it's easy to move, it's easy to store, and it's instantly verifiable, and you can't confiscate it because I hold the keys rather than it being held by one place. So governments, if they wanted to confiscate Bitcoin, would have to go around to each person individually rather than like a few big banks. the idea is that at the base layer, we have blockchain. That provides much greater transparency and cross-border auditability because you've got this public data set that everyone can look at. You've got cryptocurrencies, which promote much greater inclusion and distributed benefits through the use of smart contracts. And then finally, you have Bitcoin, which is the hard money without all of gold's flaws. And because you don't get forced onto this paper-based promissory notes, maybe this can actually last rather than a gold standard, which inevitably ends up falling apart. And you could swap these out. So maybe you're not convinced by what I've said about hard money, but actually, if we ran dollars or pounds on top of blockchain and cryptocurrencies, we could still get these benefits of greater transparency and of a more distributed financial system. So I really don't think it's a good idea to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But obviously, we're not here yet. Blockchain is too slow and too expensive, and so we need to work on new technologies which make this faster. So there's like layer 2 solutions which are effectively run on top of blockchain and are much cheaper. We've already talked a little bit about energy. I could say a lot more on that, but there are solutions in terms of moving to different proof methodologies. Cryptocurrencies themselves, people say they're too complicated, they're error prone because people can forget their passwords. There's all this hype and it's bound to come crashing down. I think all of this, there are solutions to. Early computers were complicated, but we've made them more intuitive over time. There are solutions to being error prone with like social recovery wallets, where you can actually distribute your key between multiple people and then recover funds and things. And then Bitcoin itself is perhaps the most difficult to predict because even if we actually get hard money, are people going to believe in code rather than gold? And we have all these competing systems like Ethereum and other cryptocurrencies, which are being developed much faster and are taking on new features like these smart contracts much quicker than the original. And so these could come along and actually displace Bitcoin. So I don't think Bitcoin has won the race. I think it's difficult to predict, but it has got a good shot, and we are on track. Over time, we've seen that technologies get adopted quicker and quicker. And roughly speaking, we see that the growth of users of crypto is growing at a similar pace to the internet. And we're roughly at a sort of 1998 level of internet adoption. So it's in the public consciousness, but all the major shifts and major societal changes are still yet to come. Yeah, so I think it would be good to discuss that. I've shared a lot of stuff, and you would probably disagree with some bits, maybe lots of it. But I would just, I guess, go back to this slide and point out that we can swap out these layers, and I think there are definitely benefits to be had from at least some aspects of this new crypto technology